A Supreme Court decision just came down in a 6-3 ruling. And if you think this only affects illegal crossings at the southern border, think again. Because what the court just did may reach far beyond the headlines. It touches legal residents, returning travelers, border discretion, and the government's power to treat certain people not as secure residents coming home, but as individuals who suddenly have to prove they belong here. And once you understand what this ruling really says, you start to see why immigration lawyers, green card holders, and border enforcement officials all over the country are going to be paying very close attention to what happens next. This is not one of those Supreme Court stories that sounds dramatic for a day and then disappears. This one has real consequences. The court ruled 6-3 in Blanche v. Lau that federal immigration law does not require border officers to have clear and convincing evidence at the moment of reentry before treating a lawful permanent resident as someone seeking admission instead of someone already entitled to come back in. In plain English, that means the government does not necessarily have to fully prove its case at the border first. It can make the call in the moment, and then try to justify that decision later during removal proceedings. And that shift matters because a green card holder is not supposed to be treated like just any traveler. Under the usual rule, a lawful permanent resident returning from a short trip abroad is generally admitted back into the United States. That is the default protection attached to having a green card. But there are exceptions, including for someone who has committed certain offenses involving what immigration law calls moral turpitude. The fight in this case was over a very basic but very important question. Does the government need solid proof of that disqualifying crime right then and there at the border? Or can it act first and prove the legal basis later? The Supreme Court sided with the government. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion, joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dissented, joined by Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. And the split was not just political theater. It reflected two very different views of what border power is supposed to look like when the person standing there is not a first-time migrant, not a tourist, but a lawful permanent resident of the United States. The facts of the case make this even more important. Muk Choi Lau, a Chinese citizen and lawful permanent resident, had been admitted to the United States in 2007. In 2012, he was charged in New Jersey with trademark counterfeiting. While that criminal case was still pending, he took a temporary trip to China. When he returned through JFK, border officials did not treat him as simply re-entering the country as a permanent resident. Because of the pending criminal charge, they paroled him in instead. Later, after he pleaded guilty, the government used that conviction in removal proceedings. Now, here is where the ruling gets serious. The lower court had said immigration officers needed clear and convincing evidence that Lau had actually committed the disqualifying crime at the time he tried to re-enter. The Supreme Court rejected that approach. The majority said nothing in the Immigration and Nationality Act imposes that burden on border officers, making what the court called quick judgments on the spot. In other words, the court refused to require a high evidentiary showing at the border itself. Instead, it allowed the government to rely on what is proven later, including a later conviction, to support the original decision to treat that resident as an applicant for admission. That is the legal core of the decision. But the real-world impact is where people need to pay attention. Because the issue here is not just whether someone can eventually be removed. The issue is what happens in the window before that. Once a lawful permanent resident is treated as seeking admission rather than simply returning home, that person can be placed into a much more fragile legal position. According to the dissent, that downgrade is not harmless. It can expose someone to detention or parole, and can strip away the ordinary security that comes with lawful permanent resident status. Justice Jackson warned that the court had effectively handed the government what she called a massive blank check to place lawful permanent residents into immigration limbo. And that phrase, immigration limbo, is exactly why this ruling could have nationwide implications. Because this is not just about one airport, one officer, or one resident. This is now Supreme Court precedent. It means that across the country, border authorities may have broader room to defer the hardest proof questions until later, while still making immediate entry status decisions in the moment. For green card holders with certain pending criminal allegations, even before a conviction exists at the time of reentry, that creates a new level of uncertainty around travel. A temporary trip abroad can become the moment where the legal posture of your entire case changes. And if you are wondering whether the government sees this as a narrow technical ruling, the answer is no. DHS publicly celebrated the decision, saying it gives Customs and Border Protection more flexibility, and specifically stating that CBP will be allowed to defer inspections of lawful permanent residents who committed a crime until after they are convicted, and then use that conviction to justify removal. DHS described the ruling as one of several new tools to continue securing the border. That tells you immediately how the executive branch is likely to use this case going forward, not as an academic opinion, but as expanded enforcement authority. And this is where the public conversation can get sloppy if we are not careful. Some people will hear this case and say, well, if someone committed a crime, what is the problem? But that skips the real legal tension. The dispute was never just about whether crimes matter in immigration law. Of course they do. The dispute was about when the government must prove enough to justify treating a lawful permanent resident like someone asking permission to enter, rather than someone already entitled to return. The majority said that proof can come later. The dissent said that is too late, because the damage to the resident's status may already be done by then. That is why this ruling is bigger than one man and one airport encounter. It reshapes the practical meaning of reentry for some lawful permanent residents. It strengthens the hand of immigration authorities at the border. It lowers the immediate evidentiary pressure on officers making those calls. And it sends a message that, at least for this court, border decision-making can remain fast, discretionary, and later justified through the formal immigration process. For families, that means something very concrete. A green card holder with a pending case or a legally dangerous charge may now face far more risk when traveling abroad and attempting to return. For lawyers, it means travel strategy and criminal plea consequences become even more sensitive than they already were. And for anyone following the broader immigration debate, it is another sign that the Supreme Court is willing to give the government significant room to maneuver where border authority and immigration enforcement intersect. So the bottom line is this. The 6-3 ruling in Blanche versus Lau does not just answer a technical legal question. It changes the balance of power at the border in a way that could affect lawful permanent residents nationwide. The court said border officers do not need clear and convincing evidence at the moment of reentry before treating a green card holder with a potentially disqualifying crime as an applicant for admission. The government can act first and defend that move later. Supporters will call that common sense border enforcement. Critics will call it a dangerous weakening of the security that green card status is supposed to provide. But either way, the consequences are real and the implications are national. Because when the Supreme Court says the government can justify later what it decides at the border now, that is not a minor procedural change. That is a power shift. And for a lot of lawful permanent residents, power shifts like that do not stay theoretical for very long.